Good evening and welcome once again to the Tzemach Bible Institute program. I'm John Klein, and with me this evening, as always, is Ken Garrison, pastor of Fellowship Church and founder of the Tzemach Bible Institute. Good evening, Ken.
Good evening, John.
Now, Ken, I have an interesting question tonight. Is it God's will at this time for peace in the Middle East?
Well, John, I think we're going to develop the position that peace, as it's currently being defined by the nations, is not God's will, and so we want to look at that. You know, today we're involved in a development of political coming up to elections and so on. I notice every now and then in the newspaper they will have assessment of the campaign ads and so on, and they call it truth in advertisement, and they evaluate whether the candidates are really telling the truth. If we hear about the peace process in the Middle East, if we really told the truth in advertising here, we would call it the war process, because the so-called Middle East peace process is explicitly for the purpose of wrestling the heartland, the real biblically significant area of Israel, out of the hands of the Israelis into the hands of Muslims. It's a war process. So we have an administration that's pursuing the, quote, peace process, and that's just erroneous, really. It's a war process. So we want to evaluate that very thing.
Okay. We want to look at it from God's point of view to see what he's doing today. As Ken said, in fact, it's not only the United States, the whole world is pushing for so-called Arab-Israeli peace or Israeli-Palestinian peace. There's been a number of peace plans, starting in the Madrid peace plan, Oslo, the Rogers plan, the Tenon plan. Now the current plan is called the Roadmap, and that seems to change, and it goes back and forth. But is any one of these plans God's will in light of what God's activities are? And we should be able to see God's activities from a biblical position and what's going on now to judge what's going on, Ken.
All right, so that's what we want to do on the program today. We pray that you will follow along the discussion. Even though it's almost inherent to imagine that it's God's will for peace, and ultimately he will establish peace. But the present plan, again, I would suggest, is a plan for war, not a plan for peace.
All right, so we're going to contrast then
God's
view and the humanitarian view.
We want to start, John, by just defining the conflict itself. The claim for the land. We want to look both at the so-called Palestinian as well as the Israeli claim for the land. So we would ask the question, is there a valid Palestinian claim for the land? And again, I'm going to suggest that there is the claim that is publicized, and then there is a hidden claim, and we want to develop that as we go along. But first of all, we would say that there is some validity to the fact that there has been Palestinians in the land over a long period of time, and so they make a claim to the land on that basis.
At that time, they hated the term Palestinians and refused it. It was a political, actually, ploy by Yasser Arafat in 1964 to change them, that they became the Palestinians.
Okay, but nevertheless, there has been some...
And there was a remnant of Jewish people in the land, mainly in 4 holy cities, so there were a sparse population in all the land, whether they were Jews or Arabs living in the land.
Okay, John, is there documentation for that, or is that just your opinion?
No, there's documentation, and we'll go to Joan Peters, wrote a book, an English scholar who was not a Zionist or Jewish. She wrote a book from time immemorial to see how long these Arabs had been in the land, and found out they weren't there from time immemorial. And we have books by by an American and the English archaeologists Wilson and Robinson in the 1830s through 1850s, documenting also that it was a very sparse population, a few people here, a few people there, and also by Mark Twain, who wrote a book, Can Innocents Abroad? He documents traveling for days without seeing a person.
Yeah, okay, so the point is there has been some very small remnant of both Palestinian and Jewish peoples in the land for a long, long period of time, but nothing like the present populations. And I want to get to the second claim, the real claim, the Muslim claim for the land that's not publicized in the West at all, but it is at the heart of the Muslim claim for the land, because the land of Israel, this area, was the first territory that was taken by the Muslim conquerors as they left the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century A.D. And so this area becomes the very heart. In Islam, the world is divided into what's referred to as Dar al-Islam, the territory already conquered by and under the control of Islam, and Dar al-Harb, the area of war. The rest of the world is the area of war. And so the land of Israel lies right in the heart of Dar al-Islam. So the real claim of Palestinians for the land, although that's not publicized, is a religious claim, and it's because it's in the heart of the territory already conquered by Islam.
Okay, so then serious Muslims, because of this religious claim, there could never be a peace in the Middle East where a sovereign Jewish state exists in what was once Dar al-Islam. This would be a rebuke to the Quran.
Sure.
And so they might as well throw it away from that perspective, and therefore no compromise is possible with...
Absolutely.
And it's not only the small remnant of radical Muslims that are blowing themselves up, which is, still 150 million Muslims, but it's all Islam. This is part of their core belief.
It would be, it's a core belief of Islam, so there's no question about that. So the idea of a two-state solution somehow resolving this issue is erroneous, because any sovereign Jewish state in the middle of Islam is as odious as whether it's big or small. It wouldn't matter.
So you mean as a tactical move, they might agree to some of this talk, and with the idea that eventually they'll drive the Jews into the sea.
Again, that is a proven historical tactic of Islam. It doesn't matter if you lie, if you're proceeding toward jihad and control, taking over more and more of the world. So that's just the tactic of Islam. So there's nothing new there. But at any rate, again, we're kind of getting off track of what we really want to talk about, but the concept set forth currently by the administration of the so-called two-state solution is just utterly erroneous, and I'm certain that Mr. Bush and Ms. Rice is not stupid enough not to know that.
But so they're pursuing other interests then, either oil or cheap oil or cheap oil.
I don't want to claim that they're stupid. I want to claim that they're corrupt.
Right.
In that sense. All right, so let's look now. We've looked at the Palestinian claim for the land. Let's look at the Jewish claim for the land and ask ourselves
the question, is there a valid Jewish claim?
Is there a claim? Now, the contemporary reason for the State of Israel, by the way, as far as the United States or the UN is concerned, was as a result of the Holocaust. There was a recognized need in the world for a place of a Jewish sanctuary, so to speak, a Jewish state. And so the state came into existence in 1948 on that basis. But we're going to maintain that there's a much more ancient and much more valid claim, Jewish claim to the land itself.
All right, so we want to look at events from a biblical perspective. Now, if you look at the Middle East in a biblical perspective, then you could see that God is pursuing his own peace plan. In other words, he has regathered his people. He is doing something contrary to what the will of the nations is now, because God has chosen Zion for his unique purposes, actually the purpose of redemption. And so he has regathered the Jewish people, and anyone in opposition to that is just an opposition to God's will.
Okay, so we would maintain, therefore, that the presence currently of where we something like 6 million, just maybe slightly under 6 million Jewish souls inhabit in the land of Israel. The largest concentration of Jewish people in the world now in the land of Israel, and that's really unique in itself. We believe that that is a direct fulfillment of prophecy, exactly what God predicted in the ancient Hebrew prophets. We're going to read specifically from Jeremiah, but we could read from any number of prophets that would promise the same thing.
We'll hit 3 different prophets.
Okay.
But since you mentioned Jeremiah, last week we had Jeremiah Gimpel here from Israel, and he said an interesting fact, and he said that this is the first time since in the last 2,000 years that the majority of the Jews in the world are living in Israel.
Yeah.
In other words, has the largest population of any other nation.
Actually, it's the first time in 2,600 years. It's the first time since the end of the First Temple era, 586 BC, that's true. And that's astounding if you think about it.
Okay. So let's look. God said some things as Judah was going into captivity. This is what God said. I'm in Jeremiah 16. I'll read verse 14. Therefore, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when it will no longer be said, as the Lord lives, who brought up the sons of Israel out of Egypt, but as the Lord lives, who brought up the sons of Israel from the land of the north, and from all the countries where he banished them. For I will restore them to their own land, which I gave to their fathers. So God is saying, and every Christian knows the Passover story. Every Jew obviously knows the Passover story. And God is saying that he's going to do something that's going to overshadow the Passover, the Jewish people coming out of Egypt, by what he's doing in our day, Ken.
Amen. Now, John, how do we know that this is not just a decision, a movement of populations? Sometimes we have migrations of populations.
Or the sympathy of the world.
Yeah, whatever. How do we know this is the hand of God?
Okay, in Jeremiah 31:10, this is what God said. Hear the word of the Lord, O nations, and declare it in the coastlands afar off, and say, he who scattered Israel will regather him and keep him as a shepherd keeps his flock. Now, Ken, if this is true today, how do we know this is for now, not later? Just the fact that there are more Jewish people in Israel at this time, and he says they will no longer be taken out of the land.
Right.
We can know that this is what God is doing. And
in fact, if we look at the situation historically, we understand that there has been many efforts at precipitating this so-called ingathering, and over centuries and millennia, actually.
Right.
And none of those have been successful at all. And now, beginning actually in the late 19th century, I guess we would say, in the late 19th century, this movement started very gradual, and it's just been a continuing growing movement since that time, to the point that, again, today, the largest concentration of Jewish souls live in the land of Israel. Now, we want to maintain that God has a purpose in this. It's not just a humanitarian thing. God has a specific purpose. He is moving to precipitate what we would look at an end time thing, actually precipitating rebellion in mankind.
Okay. And we're going to read a scripture from Joel that really points out what's happening here. Joel 3, verses 1 and 2. For behold, in those days And at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all the nations, bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. That's the valley, it literally means where God is judge. Then I will enter into judgment with them there on behalf of my people and my inheritance Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations, and they have divided up my land. What is the hallmark of all these peace plans we talked about?
Every one of them divides up God's land.
All right, look at verse 9 of chapter 3. God says this, proclaim this among the nations, prepare a war, rouse the mighty men, let all the soldiers draw near, let them come up. And then just the opposite of what's going to happen at the end of days, beat their swords into plowshares. This is what he said, beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weak say, I am a mighty man. So the nations are feeling their strength,
right,
and they're going to dictate to Israel what they're going to do, and it's God's going to judge them for it.
Okay, now it's very, very important that we can understand this. God is not causing rebellion in mankind. The rebellion exists. It has been obvious since the fall of man in the garden. What God is doing is bringing it to focus. He's precipitating and pulling it together to judge it in one final stroke. What the Bible speaks about Armageddon, that's the issue. Now, prophet after prophet spoke about this. John read from Joel, but we'll read also from the prophet Zechariah, which said virtually the same thing.
Okay, so let's look at Zechariah 12. I'll read verses 2 and 3. Behold, I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that causes reeling to all the peoples around. And when the siege is against Jerusalem, it will also be against Judah. And it will come about that day when I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples, and all who lift it will be severely injured, and all the nations of the earth will be gathered against it.
All right, so now again, Zechariah...
It sounds like today.
It sounds like today, and Zechariah said almost the same thing that Joel prophesied. We could see the same thing in Ezekiel. I mean, prophet after prophet saw this in visions of the future, and today we see it actually taking place. In Revelation chapter 12, there's a picture of Israel dispersed and a vision of the earth helping Israel from demonic destruction. And actually that help came from the fact that the people of Israel were scattered throughout the world, and no matter how efficient Satan happens to be at any given moment, he can only destroy a small fraction of the Jewish people. Now today they're gathered into one place and have been made uniquely vulnerable, or apparently vulnerable. If it were not for godly intervention, they would be vulnerable. But they're there. God is setting a trap for this rebellion in the nations, and the nations are falling into line to come up against it, as you read.
Now God intends to do something in the midst of the regathered Israel. There's going to be, there is now and will continue to be, and we'll see it more and more, a tremendous blessing in the midst of Israel for their faithfulness. And there are more and more faithful Israelis and observant Israelis that are coming to the forefront, such as Jeremiah that was here. Now, God is setting a trap, as Ken said, and going to stamp out rebellion in mankind as they come up against his people. Most likely, if we try to interpret things from today, it'll be that Palestinian issue. Things are going to get worse and worse for the Palestinian people, and more and more blessing on Israel, and the earth will come, the nations will come up to do something for that because of the position of the Arabs worldwide, or the Muslims.
It seems evident already. I mean, if we look daily in the newspaper or governmental positions, international conferences, whatever, you can see the position being defined very, very clearly. And now we visit the land of Israel from time to time, and you can see the process there. The people of Israel are prospering more and more and more all the time. Their boldness, their confidence, their faith. As you indicated a moment ago, just last week we had Mr. Gempel with us, a young man who is preaching biblical Zionism all over the world. It's incredible. And gosh, I remember visiting a young couple at Bethel, Shiloh area, and I was amazed at the industrious, bold attitude that they exhibited. They're on their feet. God's blessing is upon them, and it's only going to increase. And as the blessing of God upon those people, the Israelis in the land, as the blessing of God increases on them, the fate of the Palestinians are going to go the opposite direction.
It doesn't take someone with great spiritual insight to see the land blossoming as a rose today, to see that the Israelis are building everywhere, building up a nation, investing their lives, to see that blessing straight out. Now, there's a tremendous spiritual blessing that's harder to discern, but we see the Arabs burning forests and destroying, sending over rockets, and we see the Israelis building. I mean, it's right before you, and you have to be blind to see it. And this is what God said about it. He said in Isaiah 54:17, that speaking of Israel, that no weapon formed against you will prosper, and every tongue that accuses you in judgment will be condemned. So God is causing Israel to prosper, and nothing is going to hinder that, and God is condemning all the nations that are double-minded and double-tongued, in fact, just lying, Ken.
And that's true. And again, when we contrast the Israeli position to the Palestinian position, the world's going to be does look at that in the humanitarian perspective. And the Palestinians are standing directly in opposition to fulfillment of Bible prophecy. Now, it doesn't, as they say, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out if you're standing directly in the way of the advancement of God's will in the world, you're probably going to be in a very sad position. And that's exactly what's happening. In fact, we would maintain, and we believe there's evidence to indicate that God is, as it was in the biblical era, is hardening the hearts of the Palestinians, and as a result, and hardening their heart, if you really look at the language, means that he's making them foolishly aggressive. They reject every prospect of real resolution. Gaza was evacuated, given to them, and what the result is they shoot missiles, hundreds of missiles every day into Israel.
Qassam rockets, the Hezbollah in the South Lebanon did exactly the same thing. They started a war last year. So they are becoming foolishly aggressive, and they will, according to let's look what God has to say about it. In Joshua 11, I'll read verses 19 and 20. There was not a city which made peace with the sons of Israel, except the Hivites living in Gibeon. They took them all in battle. For it was of the Lord to harden their hearts to meet Israel in battle, in order that he might utterly destroy them, and that they might receive no mercy, but that he might destroy them, just as the Lord had commanded Moses.
Now
you're seeing something coming out just like that.
It's exactly the same thing, and indeed, if we as Christians look at this thing from humanitarian perspective, we're going to get diverted. We have to hold on to a faith position, a biblical position. We hear all the time of major Christian denominations divesting themselves of any involvement with Israel.
Yeah, I just read that the United Methodist Church is doing that. They came out with a 200-page document condemning Israel for everything.
Why are they doing that? Well, because they're looking at this situation from
a humanitarian
perspective without realizing any
But
kind of
that's a lie, Ken. There's 22 Arab Muslim nations and one small Jewish nation. And if you remember, Uncle Laban changed the deal about 10 times on Jacob, and that's what the nations are doing. They promised Israel all the land from the Mediterranean to Iraq was all supposed to be Jewish territory. Then they took 2/3 of it away and started a country called Transjordan. Then they took half of what was left and they called it a Palestinian state. Even that, the original Jewish founders of the state of Israel accepted that. It was the Arabs that didn't. Abbas said what Ken just said, the Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity.
Oh, okay, so that's a very common statement, and we hear that restated over and over again, but that is a simple manifestation of the scripture that you just read from Joshua. God is making, now remember the Bible, when it talks about hardening Pharaoh's heart in Egypt, the Palestinians in Joshua, the Palestinians today, what it literally says, it makes their heart strong. That means makes them foolishly aggressive. So aggressive that they will strike against reason. They won't consider rational solutions. And
so it's just a matter of time when all the nations will be coming up to crush out God's witnesses.
All right, so we already see it in the governments, and look at the media. Look how the media reports situation. Mm-hmm. One Israeli injured, 100 Palestinians killed. I mean, day after day we hear reports. Building in Gaza destroyed. They don't say a thing about the buildings in Cedar Road or Ashkelon or anything else. The media has its own foreign policy and is portraying it.
The United States wouldn't tolerate that for a minute. If they were lobbing bombs over from Mexico or Canada, we wouldn't tolerate it for a minute. And yet the world expects Israel to do nothing, and when they try to stop the bombardment, they're called massacre. They're massacring poor innocent Arabs.
All right, let me bring this back to summarize what John asked the question originally. Is it God's will for peace to be in the Middle East as it currently is set forth? We're going to maintain that it's not God's will, not at least as the nations are proposing it. We believe that God is precipitating rebellion in mankind and leading to the end time scenario of what is referred to as Armageddon. We believe that if you're not careful, your sons and daughters are going to be in the army that approaches Israel at Armageddon. We want to warn you against that. Now, come out and study with us at the Tzemach Institute. Worship with us at Fellowship Church. That's our program for tonight. Shalom.